So, hello, Toby. Uh,
Hi, Joey.
Hi, thanks very much for joining me for this conversation. And what sparked me to approach you and say, "Oh, can we have this chat?" was that when I read the Human Learning Systems ebook last summer when it had just been published, I thought it was an amazing articulation of human learning systems, an amazing analysis and proposition. But I was also just really struck by how much similarity there was between that and what I'd just been writing in the Enabling Help report, which was just about to be published. And reading it, it felt like you and I had been talking for the last 3 years and developing our ideas together, but we hadn't. I'd read a couple of your articles, but apart from that, we hadn't. And so I was just really struck by how similar it was, and curious really about how we both come from quite different places to a similar kind of critique of how things are working now and similar ideas about how it could work much better. So I just thought it'd be great to explore that together. So thank you for agreeing to do that.
Very much looking forward to it.
And so just to kind of kick off, just to introduce myself, I'm Joy MacKeith. I'm co-founder of Triangle and co-author and creator of the Outcome Star suite of tools, and author of the Enabling Help report that I was just referring to. And yeah, so over to you for a quick introduction, and then maybe just to tell us a bit about human learning systems.
Thanks, Joy. So, hello, viewers and listeners. My name's Toby Lowe. I am a visiting professor of public management at the Centre for Public Impact. I'm in the European team there at CPI, and I'm on loan to CPI from Newcastle Business School at Northumbria University. And so I've been working alongside organisations, public service organisations who want to develop alternative ways of doing public management for the last 6 or 7 years now in various different guises. And the reason I come to be talking about any of this is because for the 15 years prior to that, I was working in different voluntary and public sector organisations, most latterly as chief executive of a kind of mid-scale charity in the northeast of England. And what that gave me was a deep and abiding frustration for how funding and performance management worked, and a kind of burning desire to say we must be able to do it better than this. And that's essentially kind of where human learning systems came from. It is an alternative approach to public management, so how public service in the broadest sense. So when I'll use the term public service as a shorthand for kind of any purposeful work that supports human freedom and flourishing. But so it's public service isn't in that definition what public sector organisations do. A bunch of voluntary sector organisations do public service, a bunch of private sector organisations do public service, blah, blah, blah. So supporting public service organisations to genuinely understand and respond to the needs of people, the complex real lives of people. Because what we'd found when I was doing the work is the current dominant paradigm for public management, it's got a name, it was invented by people purposefully. It's called new public management, sometimes referred to as markets, managers and metrics, was created to kind of accompany the neoliberal ideology in the 1980s. That way of doing public management was a kind of deep structuring condition that prevented public service from meeting people's needs and from helping people to create good outcomes in their lives. So essentially, human learning systems is an alternative way of doing public management that enables public service to respond to the complex realities of the lives that people actually live, and to develop that kind of relational approach to working with people, whereby the job of public servants is to understand the lives of the people that they serve, and in order to do that, build relationships with them, and then essentially do whatever it is that they need in response to that. Right? Mm. So in some respects, it's as simple as that. Like, how do we change public management to enable public service to do the job that it's supposed to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and I like the way you've got your title, Human Learning Systems, and there's a set of thinking around the human and it being relational and human. There's a set of thinking about the learning, which is what you need if you're going to kind of respond flexibly to something that's changing rather than kind of have a one size fits all. And you've got the systems, which is kind of recognizing that our lives are complex systems, and also meeting people's needs requires usually a whole system approach rather than just one service here that's going to kind of tick the box. So you've kind of, it's all there in the title. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's weird because it almost happened by accident, because we only got the title from like listening to the language that people used when they were working in this new way. Because at the start it was a response to complexity, because we thought that new public management failed to like adequately respond to the complexity of people's lives. We didn't call the thing that the alternative we were describing anything, so it didn't have a name. So people began to kind of call it complexity of informed approaches to public management. And can you imagine a worse title than like to give a name to something than a complexity informed approach to public management? Like, how many different words that could we use to put people off? And so we just kind of started to listen to the way that the people who were working in this alternative way described it. And first of all, they said, well, this is just about being more human to each other, isn't it? We're like, oh, great, that's a chapter heading. And they said exactly in the way our method for management, our method for improving, our way of framing how any of this stuff gets any better is about learning. It's like learning in the relationship between public-facing worker and the people they support, learning between those people and their managers, learning between their managers and the senior, learning across their learning. And then, as you say, the system stuff, how is an outcome actually made? Oh, people's lives are a complex system that create outcomes. So it's all systems. Right? And to understand the interplay between all of the different things going on in someone's life that create an outcome, if you're not getting to grips with those as interdependent relationships, as systems, you haven't stand a chance.
Yeah. And something I was reflecting in another conversation recently, that it's interesting that we kind of so much want things to be able to be broken down into little parts that are then manageable, and we can just work with that part, we can just work with that part. But it's interesting that although we kind of so much want that, it's actually not that satisfying for us when we do, and we kind of also have a knowing that it kind of isn't like that. So there's an interesting kind of tension there that
exactly. It is that desire for certainty and control that a whole bunch of people feel, including me. I am like, I think part of the reason that I got into talking about this is just because, like, the way that planning works at the moment, like what we are encouraged to plan, like we're encouraged to write program plans, and those have budgets associated, right? So the whole process of planning public service is an exercise in creating what my amazing colleague Thea calls certainty artifacts. Things that make us feel like we're in control of stuff, even though we're not. At the moment, those are almost entirely exercises in making ourselves feel good. They have very little practical purpose, because what gets delivered is never the same as the program plan. The budgets are never the same as like what the spending that happens in real life. But planning is useful. Right? It's important to be able to schedule stuff and to make sure that the people are in the same room at the same time, ready to talk about, like, that stuff's useful. Like, planning is good, right? So what is it that we can plan that enables useful work to happen? That's kind of like where I'm trying to translate that need for and the importance of certainty into how can this do a useful job, rather than at the moment, at its very best, it's like a soothing thing.
Yeah. How can we make use of that invaluable technology without being seduced by it and believing that our plans have an absolute reality that they don't? I'm being reminded of I think it might be a John Lennon quote of "Life is what what happens whilst we're making plans or something like that. But anyway, I think that's probably only very tangentially relevant. So well, maybe this is a good point for me to just sort of say something about enabling help and those ideas, and then we can kind of start looking at how they interrelate. So you kind of came to this from an experience of working in management in a service provider organization, being frustrated by the kind of performance management approaches and how accountability was working. And although that has been part of my work and Triangle's work, the route has been a little bit different, which is it's been in that direct service relationship between somebody who needs help and somebody who's helping them. And through the outcome stirrs, whenever we create an outcome stir, what we do is we have a kind of in-depth look at what is that relationship, how is that working, what does really not good look like, and what does good look like, and then what are all the steps in between. And because over 20 years we've created 50 different versions of the outcome star for homelessness, mental health, young people, people with ADHD, a whole variety of sectors. We've had an awful lot of those conversations, and we've done an awful lot of that modelling. And so although there are differences, which is why if there weren't differences, we just have one outcome star, but there are differences. So we've got all these different stars. But nevertheless, when you go through that process lots and lots of times, you have a sense of a whole load of similarities. And that was one of the things that I was drawing out in the Enabling Help report, is what are the common themes of what is a really effective helping service, a helping relationship. And the things that I articulated, sort of very similar to what you were saying about being relational, that it has to be rooted in a kind of committed, trusting, trustable relationship, consistent relationship, that it needs to be flexible, sort of bespoke to that person, exactly as you said, whatever it is that needs doing. It needs to be holistic, kind of recognizing that somebody may come through the door with this particular label of a particular need, but they have a whole system of a life, and actually we need to look at all of those different elements. That it needs to be, I've used the title motivational, but basically something that matters to them and means something to them about achieving goals that they've set and that matter to them, and that recognize their agency and their strengths. And developmental, which means that it gives them a chance to develop their skills and their strengths, and gives them opportunities to change, rather than kind of being rooted in just the expertise of the person who's providing the help. So that was kind of where that formulation came from. And in some ways, I think what I've just articulated there is incredibly uncontroversial, because I've used slightly different words, but it chimes with person-centered approaches, strengths-based approaches, trauma-informed approaches. But what was really interesting and frustrating to me is that although that kind of help is what we as a sector articulate that we're trying to provide, actually the reality on the ground, because we, as well as creating stars, we train people to use them and we support people to implement them. So we get exposed to what the reality is when our beautiful developmental tool hits the real world. And what we found is that there are lots of challenges to people actually working in that way in practice, even though that is what they want to do. So that got me curious about why that was. And then sort of my kind of framing of kind of what's wrong, which is it's consistent with, but sort of differently articulated to the HLS framing, is that we've borrowed ideas from other sectors, sort of ideas that might work well in their context, but actually they don't work well in the arena of kind of complex human beings in complex contexts facing complex challenges. And so I won't kind of unpack all of that, but I talk about the sort of the medical paradigm where the helper is the expert, the bureaucratic paradigm, which is often kind of quite dominant in management, which is we'll do the same thing to everybody in the same way, and that will eliminate risk and make it fair. The market paradigm, which is very strong in sort of new public management, which is we'll create really efficient, really effective services by using the disciplines of the market. and then the natural sciences paradigm, which is applied quite a lot in research and policy making, which is we'll work out exactly which intervention works best for which problem, and then we can roll that out everywhere and everything will just be really, really effective. And so all of these different, what it's got in common is we're taking ideas that are working really well in one context, but we're bringing them maybe uncritically into a different context where, I feel that they're just making it difficult to deliver this kind of service. And I think the nub of it for me is that every part, that the outcomes are delivered in that kind of direct service delivery relationship. And so that every part of the service delivery system needs to be focused on how can we enable that relationship to have all those qualities, to be relational, flexible, developmental. And to the extent that we're doing that, we are helping. And to the extent that we take resources away from that or make it more difficult, we're not helping. So for me, it's all about keeping that frontline relationship in view and orienting everything around it. And unfortunately, not because anybody's really intending that, the machinations of the other parts of the system can take over, and we kind of lose sight of that.
And exactly, and the part of the reason that your analysis chimed so much with me was that sense of so through the various work that I've done, I've kind of seen the outcome stars in action and seen how useful that they can be as both reflective tools in a therapeutic relationship and as reflective tools in a management relationship. So I kind of have seen and know all of that stuff, but I've also exactly seen the way that the purpose of outcome stars gets subverted by attaching them to performance management regimes. So literally, organizations will only get paid if they move the average star score from this to that. And the discipline, what was interesting to me about this is that the research discipline of public management has got 30 years of evidence that says that's a terrible idea. But the consistency of the evidence around this is just it's really not funny. Like every time that you attach those kind of target-based kind of consequent regimes to metrics, the system that people create gaming. So the purpose of everyone's job turns into producing good-looking data. So we know this. As human beings, we know this. And we should just stop doing it, because it's like I say, it's not funny how consistent that as a set of evidence is. So, but whilst people are operating within that new public management paradigm, that's the only choice they have. Because the set of assumptions about how human behavior works that underpin new public management, why it's a paradigm, not just a set of practices, is that essentially all the people doing public service work are viewed as rational, self-interested utility maximizers. So if you leave public service in the hands of public servants, they will organize it for their own benefit, not to serve the people that they're supposed to be serving. So in order to get these rational, self-interested utility maximizers to actually serve people, you have to reward and punish them into doing the right thing. And in order to reward and punish people into doing the right thing, you need to have some set of objective criteria by which managers can know whether they're doing the right thing. And so all your lovely stuff about outcome stars gets perverted into this business of, we need to know which of our staff we should reward and which of our staff we should punish, because we need to motivate these selfish people into serving the people correctly.
Yeah. Although it usually happens at an organizational level rather than an individual staff level, but absolutely, yeah. And it's kind of like, because how things used to be was there wasn't a focus on outcomes, so everything was about the processes, and then it's kind of like the thinking around outcomes and having more of a focus on outcomes kind of came in, and for me that's a good idea, kind of everybody getting some clarity together about what kind of outcomes we're looking for, how we get towards them, how we get a handle on whether that's working or not, kind of all makes sense. But it's almost as if we kind of overshot. we stopped, we didn't stop at that. Okay, so what are the outcomes? Let's define them. Let's have a way of getting a handle on them. Kind of went all the way over to, we define them, we purchase them, we pay according to them, and we kind of it's kind of a little bit like killing the goose that laid the golden egg. There was this golden egg, which is a focus on outcomes, but by putting more weight on that than those outcome measures can really bear, we've kind of lost the benefits that are there.
Exactly. So if you trace this in kind of public management eras, it's typically, people talk about a kind of an era of public administration, the kind of bureaucratic paradigm you're talking before, where the focus was on input. Like what was managed was inputs, right? How many staff have we got? My job as a manager is to get as many staff as I can, because that's part of me having a power and influence. Right? Okay, then that was flawed in all the ways that's flawed. And then so people said, okay, this was really the start of the new public management period. Okay, we will manage against outputs. We will set key performance indicators in relation to how many workshops do people do, or how many sessions of this, or how many people did you see, or right? And people tried that, and that in management terms it works, because you can manage those things. You can go, okay, you promised to see 1,000 people, and you saw 1,000 people. Brilliant. Right, all of that stuff is in the control of the people that you're trying to manage, more or less. But it doesn't help create good outcomes in the world, because what you're rewarding and punishing people for is how many people you've seen. So it turns everyone's job into, like, everyone, you in the mic, more in, you quit. Okay, so then they realized that all of that management stuff wasn't actually helping to create outcomes in people's lives. So they were, okay, let's have a focus on people's lives. Let's try and we will have the same management techniques, reward and punishment and metric, but we'll just shift those to outcomes. But the problem is that an outcome is a completely different thing to an output. You cannot manage an outcome in the same way as you manage an output, because outputs are delivered. So the language of service delivery works for outputs. Outcomes are not delivered. So one of the things that we help people to get their heads around as a mindset shift is to stop using the language that outcomes are delivered. They're not. Outcomes are emergent properties of people's lives as complex systems. The only people who really create outcomes are people themselves. Right? Services don't deliver outcomes. But because if you manage on the basis of reward and punishment, and this organization gets that because they delivered this, you can't escape the service delivery. So this is why we say you can't just change some of the practices around management. You need a different public management paradigm, one that doesn't start by assuming that human beings are intrinsically selfish and need to be rewarded and punished to do the right thing.
And I think a really unfortunate part of that is that you can even start to get kind of conversations about whose outcome it is, because actually the outcome has been contributed by a number of different services, but because everybody needs to demonstrate an outcome, you can get sort of silly conversations,
No, they're my person. That's my. And
whereas actually what we need to encourage is collaborative service delivery systems that are all working towards the same goal. Yeah,
exactly. And one of the kind of my early realizations around this was that whole target-based approach to performance management. And it doesn't matter whether the targets are based on outputs or on outcomes, it has the same thing. Basically, it subverts and flips round the relationship between the public-facing worker and the person being served. We know what that relationship should be. I, as a worker, should be saying to you, essentially, who are you? How can I help understand who you, how can we understand who you are and what your strengths and needs are, and how can I help? That's we know that that's the relationship that makes good things happen, right? But the performance management, the target-based performance management systems, they flip that around. So the worker is saying to the person, how can you help me achieve my targets?
Yeah.
Because that's what the worker is being assessed on by their bosses, what they're getting promoted or sacked for, what they're getting bonuses or not for, is have you hit your targets? So the person being served becomes a mechanism to help the worker achieve their targets. It completely flips round the power in that relationship. You become a means to serve me.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the difficulty, one of the difficulties with payment by results is that it actually really works, in the sense that if you pay people to achieve a particular outcome, they really will focus on that outcome. And sometimes that will be exactly the right thing to do for that person, but sometimes it won't be. And then so unfortunately, through a system which is ultimately intended to achieve good things, there's nobody in this system that's kind of, wants an inefficient system or doesn't want people's needs to be met, but through a system that doesn't really take into account the human nature of the business of kind of service provision, it's perverted or kind of steered off course. And I mean, the example I like to give sometimes is, keeping a child out of care. That can be an outcome. Who can argue with that? That is a good outcome. Having said that, if the child is safe at home, then it's a good outcome. But if the child isn't safe in the home, then it isn't a good outcome. So exactly. And there are many other examples, but that's a sort of particularly stark one. So it doesn't make sense to try and define outcomes in the same way, sort of out of context.
Exactly, and this is where we developed the language of the human element of this, and really explored what that meant exactly to pursue that idea. So we talk now that we use the language that the purpose, from a human learning systems perspective, the purpose of public service is to enable human freedom and flourishing. And if you take that idea seriously, then the only person with the right to define what a good outcome looks like in their life is the person themselves. No, what, like, with the caveats around children and capacity and all of that kind of stuff, which are important, but like those are kind of technical things. The general principle, if we're talking about outcomes in my life, only I get to say what a good outcome is. No one else, if we take human freedom seriously, no one else should define what a good outcome is for me except me.
It's interesting because we've come across that a lot, in the development process for creating different outcome stars, and there are some kind of, you could say, kind of quite clear-cut things, like, say in the context of dementia or severe learning disability, where the person doesn't have a means of communicating, and kind of there are others need to discern based on behavior what's right for the person. But interestingly, it does seem to come in quite often that sometimes people need somebody else to hold a bigger vision of what's possible, and that actually, if people have been ground down over years, possibly sometimes over generations, of poverty or discrimination, then actually, if you ask them what they want, they'll sort of describe a more comfortable cage kind of thing. So actually, there is a role for the service and the person helping in actually holding a higher aspiration, and that's part of what is kind of hardwired into the outcome stars, that sometimes, often at the beginning of the journey, we might have a word kind of like stuck or not ready for help or something like that, where actually the person says, it's fine, yeah, I don't, and can you please go away? But actually it isn't fine, and it isn't fine for them as well as, for other people. But there's a process, where the worker holds a bigger vision.
And I could not agree more with all of that stuff. And it's really an important nuance to bring to this, that sense that no one has the right to define an outcome in my life but me, but I might well need help, exactly as you said, in understanding what's possible. Because for all exactly the reasons that you spoke about then, that my sense of what's possible for me might have been, I love your word, ground down, or trauma is a really important factor here, like a bunch of other stuff. And as exactly a worker with a strong relationship with that person is exactly in that, it has that capacity to say, okay, this, yeah, exactly. this is where you are now, but and it's almost, and it is an intrinsically time-based process, right? Because that person at the start of the process, the place where they get to, if you'd asked them here in that process whether that's possible, whether that was even imaginable or not, they would have probably said nah. Like, because the charity I used to run was an arts charity, right? So we did participatory arts work, and one of the most common stories we would hear from our participants at the end of the programs was that they created stuff, including new narratives for themselves, that they said, if you'd have asked me here whether it would be possible for me to get here, I'd have said no, not a chance. But understanding the work as a developmental process in itself for people, and enabling the management of that work to follow and nurture that process of development, and wherever it goes is probably the right thing for those people, with boundaries and guidelines and things to keep it safe and what have you and all of that stuff. But that sense of it must change, like the aim of the work in really personal terms, what matters to that person and where they're trying to get to, has to change as they change, as the world changes, as their confidence and engagement in the world grows, right?
Yeah. Right.
I knew we were going to get a bit excited in this.
We've reached a point of excited agreement. I wonder whether we could sort of move on to thinking about, we have a bit, but even more kind of what HLS is or prescribes, because we've spent quite a bit of time talking about kind of what doesn't work and how things are at the moment, and how that's frustrated you, and how I've seen that get in the way in terms of implementing stars in the way that they're meant to be used. I wonder whether we could just maybe, kind of close with a bit more on, so if people are watching this going, yes what, but how yeah. that we sort of speak to that a little bit.
Nice. So what we've discovered in the last kind of 18 months, maybe 2 years, time flies ridiculously, of doing this work, is that what seems to be the key as a change in terms of change of management practice around this is this idea of learning as the management strategy. Learning as a management strategy for a person, for a team, for an organization, for a place, country. Because it's exactly picking up on one of the points that you made earlier, that if we say combine those things we were talking about before, that the only people who can define what the right thing is for a particular person are the person themselves and that worker who has a really strong developmental relationship with them, right? So what a good outcome looks like is defined by them and changes, evolves over time. It means you can't like set a goal for that work in advance and manage to it. So like, what is manageable about that process? What we realize by being with the people doing the work, that what is manageable about that whole process is that as a learning process. So framing the public facing worker's job as a learning cycle, where it starts by them understanding a person's life as a system, helping both them and the person themselves see all of the complexity of their life as a system that is currently producing one set of outcomes and would like to produce a different set of outcomes. So and then once they understand someone's life as a system, once they both understand a person's life as a system that is producing a particular outcome, and they go, okay, we need to design some experiments and explorations to see whether we can get that system to produce a different pattern of results. So let's design those experiments and explorations. Then we can run those experiments and explorations, see, like, let's try this and see what happens. And then because those are run as proper experiments and explorations with data collected and reflection and shared sense making and blah, 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 rigorous learning processes, then they can go, okay, this seemed to work. we should do some more of that. Let's create behavior change and structural change in your life to support that kind of stuff. And so that's your learning cycle for you as a person. And we've learned a bunch of stuff as an organization about how to support you. It turns out that if we need to support you and a ton of other people like you, we need to change our practices around this. Blah, blah, blah. So
sorry, go on.
So framing the public facing work of people as that learning cycle, understand the system, co-design experiments, run the experiments, embed and influence the result of those. When we can understand that that's how public facing work is structured, then we see that what was the most surprising to us is that then the same learning cycle applies at the team scale, and then at the organizational scale, and then because basically what you're getting is a bunch of people who are experimenting with stuff throws up patterns of interesting stuff that need to be changed for how that team or that organization works. So if you're going to provide bespoke support to this person to do this, and bespoke support to this person to do this, and this person to do it, when you look at the pattern of what's happening from all of those experiments, you're like, oh, we need to change how we recruit our staff because we're just not getting the right staff into people. We need to change how our staff are able to spend money in support of people, because at the moment our systems are so bureaucratic that we've got budgets for people to spend, but they can't spend them because they need to come back to a team meeting and request cash from blah, blah. A bunch by framing that work as experiments on the ground, you get a bunch of really good data about what you need to change as an organization.
Yeah.
And so that becomes the learning cycle then at the team scale and at the organizational scale. People run experiments to go, okay, this is the challenging that's coming up from the work. How do we change how we work in order to enable that to work better?
Yeah. I mean, that just chimes so much with kind of the where we're coming from with the outcome star and what the outcome star is trying to do. Because at that kind of public facing service level, which is where the stars are used, all the stars are underpinned by a journey of change, and they're different depending on the sector, but often there's something around kind of stuck, can't engage with the problem, accepting help, okay, if you can do something. That kind of a believing stage, which is like, oh, okay, there are things I can do. People do believe in me. Maybe I can believe in myself. And then the next stage, probably the longest one, is the learning. It's the learning stage. And then you get to the top, which is outcome achieved, which defined in different ways. It might be I don't need a service anymore. It might be my well-being has been maximised or whatever, depending on the sector. But that learning stage, that's exactly what's happening. The person's trying to do something this way. It didn't work, okay, but now I know that way doesn't work. And now I try it this way and that does work. And that's where that's where you really need somebody alongside you to kind of keep the faith. And then the data that's generated through the outcome star, what we always say to people is, this information will help you it won't give you final answers, but it will help you ask better and better questions. And that's where it can sometimes be frustrating if people treat it in too absolute a way. But actually, this is really useful intelligence to you about what's going well and what isn't, and it will help you ask more questions and hone down. And then that's what we really hope people will do with their commissioners. So very much like you're saying, a kind of learning strategy for management, kind of a learning approach to accountability. So if I'm the commissioner, I don't say to you, did you achieve the target? I say, did you measure outcomes? Show me what you gathered, show me what you learned, show me what you're doing differently now.
What did you learn?
So I'm holding you accountable. You are a good service provider if I can see that you're taking that kind of learning approach and acting on it. And even at the research level, I think rather than the kind of the focus that can be on this intervention, for this kind of client group, does it work or doesn't it work? And that's your kind of set up for your randomized control trial. And but often I know there are all sorts of ways in which those trials don't work because people don't behave in the way that you need them to behave for an experimental condition. But actually, I think if people were to ask the questions, how can we create service delivery systems that have these attributes, that where learning is the strategy, where at the direct service delivery level the service is relational, motivational, flexible, that kind of thing, then I think we're on to a rich seam of research about how to do that.
Exactly. That's it. We find ourselves in violent agreement about a whole range of things, George. Exactly, because as you say, the process of treating the experiments and explorations that go on in each person's life that are being facilitated through kind of that effective relational service, capturing and sense making data rigorously around that gives a whole mine of intelligence that currently we're lacking. And the as you say, focusing the governance and accountability on, is that learning happening appropriately? Are people doing the learning processes that they said they were going to do? Are people are the right people being included in those learning processes? Does everyone who should have a voice in those learning processes have a voice? Are they being taken seriously? Those become exactly the kind of accountability questions that commissioners and other kind of place-based like folks can ask of organizations in that space. And so we call that role system stewardship. Right? The people that you are responsible for running an effective learning cycle at your particular system scale. So you're responsible for when you come to understand the system that is producing the outcomes at your scale, you're responsible for ensuring that everyone's voice is included, and you've actually done the work to listen to those you find hard to hear, and blah, 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 you know, all of that stuff. That's what people should be held accountable for, right? In those conditions. And then the other thing that you said then that really chimed with me is that what this requires is a shift away from doing the kind of reductionist research processes. Did this work better than this? Right? Because and what frustrates me about this is that kind of work, as soon as we acknowledge that outcomes are emergent properties of complex systems, that kind of randomized control stuff it's simply not epistemologically appropriate. It's just the wrong method to use. It's not robust at all. If someone wrote, when I'm back in a kind of teaching environment, if an undergraduate student wrote me an essay saying, oh yeah, we should use a randomized control trial to assess whether this thing is working, I would fail them because it's provably wrong. That answer, right? So the idea that the RCT stuff is robust, it's simply not true. As you can tell, that kind of stuff winds me up quite a lot. Because in a complex system, it is impossible to control for all the relevant variables that would make a randomized control trial work.
And I think in practice, what that means is that people running those trials get into quite difficult situations where they have to make difficult choices about, well, that person didn't come back, you know, so do we count them as in or out? Or, I mean, I don't know all the details, but I think it ends up becoming quite an approximation. So something that looks on the outside as a very rigorous thing actually ends up having to involve quite a lot of judgments. So yeah, it's a good tool, but, you know, just as you don't want to use a hammer to, you know, screw in a nail, you know, a hammer's a good tool, you know, when you need a hammer, you know, but yeah.
I mean, I quite like the fact that people do randomized control trials of like, does this drug
absolutely
work under these conditions, because the causal chains are short enough and people can control like relevant variables. Now, one could argue that the failure of drugs in this thing is also to do with the fact that they are treating human beings as closed systems when we're open systems. But let's park that problem for a minute. So I would say that yes, there are certain epistemological conditions under which randomized control trials are very useful things. In social circumstances, they are really expensive ways of producing what looks like reliable, robust data, but isn't. So they are very expensive ways of producing misleading looking data.
It's another one of those things of kind of borrowing something from somewhere else, but if it doesn't fit for your sector, then it doesn't help.
Exactly. It's your kind of natural sciences paradigm point. But
Yeah.
actually, the thing that I would say is that the RCT stuff is actually only a very narrow version of the natural science paradigm.
Yeah.
Because if you're an ecologist, right, you would never say that a randomized control trial is the appropriate epistemological tool for to generate insights about ecological systems. That's natural sciences.
Yeah. And that sort of that kind of makes me think of an analogy that I've sometimes used, that you know, that kind of a lot of these approaches are kind of underpinned by a kind of machine kind of model, a kind of reductionist chop it down into little pieces and manipulate the little pieces. But actually something kind of like a garden analogy is much better, because you can still be intentional. And as you were pointing out in sort of talking about how holding people to account, sort of the system stewards, you know, this isn't throwing out accountability. This is actually quite a difficult form of accountability that, you know, so it's not necessarily a kind of an easy option. In many ways it's a more complex option that requires more of us, and sort of to go back to my analogy, you know, so with a garden you can be intentional. You can say, you know, I want to have, you know, shrubs here, and I want to have flowers here, and I want to have this in, you know, blooming in the spring and whatever. But you can't dictate it. It's much more of a tending approach, and it's actually more rewarding as well. So although it's more challenging, it is also more rewarding. Yes, but it's not something that you dictate every step of the way. It's something that you support and encourage.
Exactly, and the language that we have tried to develop around this is that the approaching public management in that kind of gardening, tendering, nurturing way that you've described before is actually to reflect the reality of the work. It's why we call the ebook Public Service for the Real World, because reality is complex and messy. And when we simplify and abstract it to make it manageable in that traditional new public management sense, we are doing it a disservice, because we make it fail because we're trying to make the task of management easier. And the accountability point, I think, is really, really important, because whenever we talk about this stuff, someone always says, well, so what about accountability and how does that work? And my kind of the response I've got to at the moment, from like seeing the research evidence around this, because let's use the evidence around this, is we don't have accountability right now. Right? New public management creates the performance of accountability, but it doesn't have accountability. But look at the research evidence, right? Target-based performance management systems, and this is interestingly, this is across all sectors, so private sector, public sector, target-based performance management. The meta study of the impacts of those. So if you believe the hierarchy of evidence thing, this is the highest form of research evidence there is, right? 82% of studies into target-based performance management find evidence of gaming. So people deliberately manipulating data to produce better looking results. And 3/4 find evidence of lying, like people like deliberately lying. So as clear as day, we do not have accountability in new public management. We have what looks like accountability, but it's a bunch of people making stuff up. So when people ask, what about accountability? My response now is yes, let's create some.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm just thinking that maybe we've kind of agreed ourselves into into submission, and maybe it's time for us to kind of wind up. I don't know if there's any final things that you wanted to say.
I wondered whether there were a kind of any areas of particular difference that we wanted to explore, but maybe we could leave that for a second part of the conversation.
Yeah, areas of difference between human learning systems and the enabling help.
Because it can be like in the kind of edges of this stuff that and you can see that see the bits that do fit. We've talked a lot about the bits that kind of almost have perfect alignment. Where is there less good fit, and where's there like interesting stuff to resolve? That might be
because
our next game.
That would be the learning edge, wouldn't it? So I think that's a great idea. Yes, to make the video watching manageable. Do we call that a part 2? And that would be really good to do. Yeah. So if people want to find out more about human learning systems, where should they look?
So the easiest thing to remember is the Human Learning Systems website, which is www.humanlearning.systems. So it's humanlearning.systems. And basically everything that we've ever found out about human learning systems is on there somewhere. It's starting to get a little bit like disorganized around the edges because we've just kind of piled stuff on there. So but
they can find the ebook there, and a more recent practical guide.
The practical guide there, and also the practical guide. So the last thing we produced was kind of commissioned by Healthcare Improvement Scotland, because the Scottish folk are going quite big on human learning systems as a change mechanism for Scottish health and social care work. So they commissioned this Human Learning Systems, a practical guide for the curious. And you can find that either via the Human Learning Systems website or via the Centre for Public Impact website. So if you go to the if you put Centre for Public Impact and Human Learning Systems in your into your favorite search browser, you will find it that way too.
Great. And if people want to look at the Enabling Help report, that's on the Outcome Star website. There's a page on Enabling Help, and there's also a couple of YouTube videos on Enabling Help. Just search my name and Enabling Help. So I think we've previewed a part 2. So, but we'll call it a day for now. And thank you very much, Toby. It's been just great fun agreeing with you.
Thank you, Joy. Yeah, that was a lot of fun.